Hidden deep within the misty Ozark Mountains lies a place locals dare not enter, Devil's Hollow. For over a century, travelers have whispered of strange lights, unearthly screams, and a family bound to darkness beyond comprehension. No one dares to stay, yet the stories persist, growing darker with each retelling. Tonight, we venture into the heart of the Hollow, uncovering the terrifying fate of its infamous inhabitants. Stay with us and discover what secrets the Devil's Hollow kin tried to bury forever. If you enjoy these journeys into history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Long before Devil's Hollow earned its fearful reputation, the land was untouched wilderness, stretching across the rolling Ozark ridges like a silent, unbroken sea of trees. Into this untamed expanse arrived a man whose name would be whispered for generations, Silas Crowther. A figure of both cunning and cruelty, Silas was unlike the humble settlers that eked out a living in nearby valleys. He sought not mere survival, but dominance over the land itself, and perhaps over those who would follow in his footsteps. Silas was a man feared for his temper and unmatched for his ferocity. Stories say he could fell a man with his bare hands, and that his gaze alone could silence a room. But his ambitions were not enough to satisfy him. He hungered for wealth, power, and a legacy that would endure beyond death. And in the shadow of this desire, legend says he made a deal, a pact whispered about in trembling voices even a century later. It is said that one night, beneath a blood-red moon, Silas entered the deep heart of the Hollow. He carried offerings, the firstborn of his livestock, fine tools, and a silver cup engraved with symbols no one alive could decipher. The air was thick with mist and the scent of rotting leaves. There alone in the dense darkness, he called upon a presence older than the mountains themselves. Some claim it was the devil. Others say it was a spirit of the land, angered by the intrusion of men. Whatever it was, the outcome would shape every generation that followed. The pact was simple in its promise. Silas would gain fertile land, protection from his rivals, and prosperity beyond imagination. But every boon came at a cost, invisible yet unavoidable. He would pass down not just the land, but a curse woven into the very blood of his descendants. They would prosper, yes, but with darkness at their heels. A hunger for power that would never abate, madness that would gnaw at reason, and deformities that would mark them as different, feared and reviled as the years passed. The legend of Silas Crowther grew. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of his cruelty, how he punished those who trespassed on his land, how he took liberties with the helpless, and how strange occurrences always seemed to follow him. Livestock would die under mysterious circumstances, crops would rot overnight, and the wind seemed to carry his laughter long after he had gone. To some, these were the first signs of the Bloodline's curse. To others, mere coincidence. But within the family, the fear was undeniable. Silas's children grew up under the weight of his tyranny, and whispers of the pact haunted their dreams before they could even understand it. Every act of cruelty, every whisper of unnatural behavior, every strange deformity that appeared among the Crowthers was seen as a manifestation of the pact's cost. Some were small at first, a child born with a crooked finger, a streak of white hair, or an unusual temperament. But as the family grew, the effects intensified. Madness would strike seemingly at random. Siblings turned on one another, cousins became withdrawn and violent, and the very earth around the Hollow seemed tainted, as though the mountains themselves conspired to isolate the family from the world. Silas, however, remained unrepentant. To him, the cost was acceptable. Power, prosperity, and a legacy etched into the very soil of Devil's Hollow were worth any price. Yet in the quiet moments, even he could not escape the feeling of being watched, of whispers trailing him wherever he went, and shadows moving just beyond the reach of his firelight. Perhaps this was the first true sign of the curse awakening. a subtle warning that the pact he had made was binding not just his soul, but the souls of all who would follow Dot by the time Silas died. The foundations of the Devil's Hollow kin were already set. The land was fertile, the family prosperous, but the shadows of madness, deformity, and fear had already begun to take root. Neighboring settlers avoided the Hollow entirely, citing stories of unnatural happenings and of a family whose behavior was increasingly erratic, even dangerous. And within the walls of the Crowther cabins, a whispering reminder persisted. The Devil's pact was not broken, and every generation that followed would inherit both the land and its curse. Patriarch's pact was more than just a deal for wealth and power. It was the seed from which all future horrors would grow, a darkness woven so tightly into the bloodline that no escape would ever be possible. And thus, the stage was set for the tragedies, hauntings, and terror that would define the Devil's Hollow kin for decades. A legacy of fear, isolation, and inevitability, waiting silently in the shadows of the Hollow, biding its time. As the years passed, the Crowther family grew in number, yet dwindled in humanity. Silas's descendants inherited not only the land of Devil's Hollow, but also the weight of the unholy pact he had made. Each generation seemed marked from birth, pale skin, sharp features, or subtle deformities that made them stand apart from ordinary folk. Even the neighbors who dared a passing glance spoke of their uncanny eyes, as if the family could peer into the very souls of those who crossed their path. Isolation became their creed. No outsiders were welcomed, and any who attempted to linger were met with suspicion, if not outright hostility. The Crowthers built crude cabins along the edges of the Hollow, each structure close enough to signal unity, but far enough apart to avoid the constant friction that came from living so many under one roof. Within these walls, the bloodline thrived in secrecy, perpetuating habits and rituals that the outside world would find unthinkable. Families' children were the first to bear the brunt of the curse. Many were born weak or malformed, some with eyes that glimmered unnaturally in dim light, or with hands too large or too twisted to function normally. Still, the parents pressed on, raising their children with a fierce sense of loyalty to their lineage. They whispered constantly of the family's legacy, teaching them that leaving Devil's Hollow would invite death, that the curse would consume any who sought to escape. By the time the children were old enough to understand, fear had already taken root in their hearts, a fear of the world outside and of the dark legacy within. Stories of their unusual behavior began to circulate in the surrounding valleys. Travelers who skirted the Hollow spoke of seeing children wandering barefoot through the mist, eyes wide and unblinking, muttering words that no human should know. Neighbors claimed livestock vanished or were found mutilated, crops failed inexplicably, and faint, sorrowful wails echoed on nights when the wind blew cold through the trees. It was as though the very land had become a reflection of the Crowther bloodline, beautiful on the surface, but tainted and sinister at its core. With each passing generation, the family became more insular. Marriages within the family were common, ensuring the blood remained pure, as the elders insisted. But this only strengthened the curse's grip. Children were born with ever more disturbing traits, unnatural strength coupled with volatile tempers, eyes that seemed to burn with malevolent intelligence, or eerie, preternatural calm in moments of violence. Those few children who appeared normal were the exceptions, often regarded with suspicion, as though their lack of affliction was proof of rebellion against the bloodline. Yet despite these horrors, the family persevered. Within the Hollow, they carved out a rhythm of life that outsiders could never understand. They hunted the forests, tended the soil, and repaired the cabins, all while living under the weight of stories older than any living member could recall. Their lives were defined by routine, superstition, and an unspoken understanding that one misstep could bring ruin upon them all. The Hollow's proximity to civilization remained minimal. and townsfolk avoided the area whenever possible. Local children were warned never to venture near, lest they be taken or cursed. Even adults, hardened by life on the frontier, gave the Crothers a wide berth, sharing hushed warnings of the family's unpredictable violence. Those who encountered the family spoke of strange clothing, of voices that rose and fell in eerie cadence, and of eyes that seemed to bore into a person's soul. The hollow became more than a place. It became a warning, a living testament to what isolation, blood, and superstition could produce. Superstition blended seamlessly with reality. Within the hollow, older Crothers taught the young to respect the invisible boundaries of their world. Certain areas of the forest were taboo, sacred, or haunted. The rivers had currents that ate the unwary, and the winds carried voices of ancestors, reminding them of the pact that bound them. The children learned quickly. Obedience was survival. Any deviation could trigger the curse's wrath, whether through sickness, accidents, or unexplainable misfortune. By the time the third and fourth generations emerged, the family had become almost unrecognizable to anyone who had known Silas. Their features had sharpened, their voices taken on an uncanny tone, and their movements held a predatory quality. Outsiders spoke of shadows moving faster than human sight, figures glimpsed through misted windows, and laughter that chilled the bone. Within the hollow, fear and loyalty coexisted, ensuring that each member carried on the family's rituals and traditions, and unwittingly perpetuated the curse that had taken root centuries ago. The Crothers' isolation was no longer just physical. It was spiritual. By shutting out the outside world, they strengthened the influence of the pact on their bloodline. The forest became a cocoon of darkness, growing more suffocating with every passing year, and the hollow's very soil seemed to resonate with the cries and fears of those who had come before. In this way, generations of darkness were not merely inherited, they were nurtured, cultivated, and allowed to fester, ensuring that the Devil's Hollow kin would always remain apart from the world, haunted by the legacy of a single man's fateful deal. Devil's Hollow was not merely a place of family tragedy and inherited curse. It was a living, breathing enigma. Those who traveled near its borders often felt an immediate, unexplainable unease. The air seemed thicker here, heavy with mist and the scent of decaying leaves. Birds fell silent, and even the wind appeared to hesitate among the trees, as though the hollow itself were aware of every intruder and ready to judge them. Tales from the surrounding valleys spoke of hunters who had ventured too close. Some returned, trembling and mute, speaking only in fragments about fleeting shadows or unearthly cries that seemed to follow them for days. Others never returned at all, their absence adding yet another layer to the hollow's growing legend. The locals whispered that the hollow took what it wanted, and the Crowther family, they insisted, were its guardians. One such story recounted a traveling merchant named Thomas Weaver, who had ignored the warnings of nearby settlers. Intent on cutting a shortcut through the hollow, he arrived at dusk, unaware of the silent eyes that watched from behind twisted trees. As night fell, he reported hearing faint, childlike laughter, followed by whispers that seemed to call his name. The voice was neither human nor animal, and it moved as if it were alive. Frightened, he fled, but he swore that figures were moving alongside him, always just beyond the corner of his eye, disappearing whenever he turned to confront them. Weaver arrived at the nearest town days later, disheveled and shaking, claiming the hollow had followed him, and that the family's eyes had been watching him from every shadow. Hunters who dared enter the forest to track game often returned with their dogs missing, livestock found mutilated, or tools mysteriously broken. Strange symbols, carved crudely into trees or scratched into rocks, became more frequent, almost as if a warning were being etched into the forest itself. Some believed these were messages from the spirits of the land, others thought them the work of the Crothers. a secret language passed down to the children to mark trespassers. No one could say for sure, and those who stayed too long in the hollow almost always lost their way, emerging hours later with no memory of how they had wandered so far off trail. The hollow's reputation grew, fed by whispers and half-told stories that traveled between communities. Children were warned never to approach the forest, and even adults hesitated to stray for well-trodden paths. Travelers reported seeing figures in the fog, tall, gaunt shapes with unnaturally pale skin, moving silently among the trees. They appeared human at first, but their movements were wrong, too slow or too quick, and their eyes glimmered with something that no living person could possess. Some accounts told of faint lights flickering through the trees at night, like lanterns carried by invisible hands. The lights would dance along the forest floor, vanish into the mist, and sometimes return, trailing in patterns too deliberate to be random. On particularly cold nights, townsfolk claimed to hear chanting or murmuring carried on the wind, words in a language no one recognized, spoken with a cadence that seemed to freeze the blood. It was as though the hollow itself communicated through these sounds, using the Crowther family as its voice. Those who survived encounters with the hollow often returned forever changed. Dreams became plagued with figures standing silently in the shadows, whispering warnings or demands. Anxiety, paranoia, and fear took root in the mind like a creeping frost. Some could not speak of what they saw, fearing ridicule or disbelief, while others became obsessed with the hollow, compelled to return despite the danger. Even animals reacted instinctively. Dogs barked and refused to enter the forest. Birds avoided the hollow entirely, and horses would shudder violently if forced near its borders. The land seemed alive in a way that was both beautiful and menacing, an ever-present reminder that some places were meant to remain untouched. By this time, the Crowthers themselves had become almost indistinguishable from the forest they inhabited. Their eyes glinted in the darkness, their presence often felt more than seen. Outsiders swore that the family could appear where least expected, watching silently from behind trees, only to vanish when approached. Whispers spoke of children born with unnatural abilities, quick, quiet, and eerily perceptive. The hollow's influence, compounded by the pact Silas had made, had transformed both land and people into a single, unified entity, a dark, watchful force that brooked no intrusion. It was in this tense, unwelcoming environment that Devil's Hollow became synonymous with fear. The tales of those who had encountered its inhabitants, survived its dangers, or vanished without a trace created an aura that would persist for decades. To outsiders, the Crowther family was no longer simply human. They were a living legend, a reflection of the Hollow itself, mysterious, dangerous, and haunted by the shadows of generations past. Within the walls of the Crowther cabins, the curse of Devil's Hollow was no longer a tale whispered by outsiders. It had become a living, breathing reality. Shadows moved where no one stood, and the floorboards themselves seemed to groan with voices from the past. Each generation inherited not just the land, but a subtle madness that seeped into the very marrow of their bones. Parents would wake to the sound of children whispering in empty rooms. Children would wake to the sensation of eyes watching them from the corners of the dark. The Hollow did not merely house the Crowthers. It consumed them. The family's rituals, once simple attempts to honor the land or protect their children, had become increasingly strange and obsessive. Candles burned endlessly on the windowsills, offering light to unseen presences. Symbols, carved into the walls and etched into the wooden floors, formed a latticework of protection and warning. Mothers whispered cautions to children about the voices that roamed the Hollow at night, claiming that disobedience could summon death. The line between superstition and reality blurred. What the Crowthers feared often materialized with a cruel precision. It was said that the spirits of their ancestors haunted the Hollow, restless and angry. Some appeared in dreams, issuing commands or delivering threats, while others manifested as fleeting figures along the ridges or behind the cabin walls. The children, in particular, were sensitive to these presences. Some would speak to shadows that no one else could see. Others would recoil in terror at whispers carried on the wind. The elders insisted this was the bloodline speaking to itself, a reminder that the pact Silas had made could never be escaped. Physical manifestations of the curse became more pronounced as time went on. Some children were born with deformities, eyes too large, hands too long, or twisted limbs that made movement awkward and frightening. Others displayed unnatural strength or startling intelligence, coupled with violent outbursts that terrified even the most stoic adults. Families who had lived peacefully within the hollow found that arguments could escalate into sudden, inexplicable acts of brutality. A thrown tool, a slammed door, or a glance from the wrong person could trigger chaos within minutes. Even the land itself seemed infused with the bloodline's torment. Livestock became sickly or aggressive. Crops failed without explanation. Wells ran dry or became fouled. Some nights, an unearthly stench of sulfur and decay would waft through the hollow, lingering for hours, a reminder that the pact had marked the very soil. Animals behaved unpredictably. Dogs refused to enter the cabins at night. Birds abandoned the trees, and cats hissed at invisible threats. It was as though the hollow had become a living, malevolent entity, shaping the lives of those who dared inhabit it. Paranoia flourished alongside the curse. Family members watched each other with suspicion, fearing that disobedience or weakness might draw the wrath of the unseen forces around them. Secrets were guarded jealously. Even siblings would lie to one another to protect themselves. Small betrayals, real or imagined, could ignite fury that would consume entire households. In some cases, children were locked in dark rooms for weeks, a punishment meant to protect them from the whispering shadows, but which only seemed to magnify the madness within. Dreams became another battleground. The young Crothers often reported nightmares in which their ancestors appeared, demanding obedience or threatening death. Others spoke of being trapped in forests that stretched endlessly, pursued by figures who mirrored themselves. The elders warned that sleep was dangerous, yet even wakefulness offered no reprieve. At times, voices whispered in the corridors or behind closed doors, echoing events that had yet to happen, or recalling sins long forgotten. Within this oppressive environment, a cycle of fear, superstition, and supernatural torment entrenched itself in every corner of the hollow. The children grew up knowing the land as both protector and predator. The adults became prisoners of rituals they barely understood, compelled by a mixture of reverence and terror. The pact of Silas Crowther had not only cursed the bloodline, but had transformed the family's entire existence into a testament of dread, a living horror that could not be escaped out as the years passed. The line between reality and the supernatural blurred further. Shadows moved independently of any light source. Faint figures appeared in reflections of windows, vanishing when approached. Whispers became voices, voices became screams, and the very earth seemed to tremble with the weight of centuries of fear. The hollow was no longer simply a home. It had become a labyrinth of torment, a mirror of the family's fractured minds, and a breeding ground for the madness that would define each new generation, even the strongest. Among them, the adults who had survived decades of hardship and isolation could not resist the hollow's influence. They, too, experienced visions, nightmares, and the unshakable feeling of eyes upon them. Some whispered to themselves in the dark, as if trying to bargain with the spirits or shadows that haunted the cabins. Others succumbed entirely, wandering into the woods at night and vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only the echo of their screams and the certainty that the curse of Devil's Hollow was unrelenting. The bloodline's torment was cyclical, self-perpetuating, and absolute. Each child born into the hollow inherited not only the land, but the madness, fear, and supernatural vigilance of their ancestors. The whispers, shadows, and visions were no longer mere folklore. They were the lifeblood of the family, a constant reminder that the Devil's Hollow kin were bound by their own blood, haunted in every waking moment, and doomed to live under the unyielding eye of an unseen force that demanded obedience, terror, and reverence above all else. By the time the Hollow had been home to several generations of the Crowther family, the line between human and horror had all but vanished. Fear and superstition, nurtured over decades, had taken root in every mind, twisting every thought into suspicion and every action into potential violence. Within the cabins, paranoia ruled. Siblings whispered accusations. Parents scolded not only for deeds, but for thoughts. And every small infraction became a potential spark for chaos. It began with small acts. Tools misplaced, food stolen, or words spoken too boldly. In a family already haunted by visions, these trifles became proof of betrayal. The bloodline, already sensitive to the invisible eyes of ancestors, and the hollow itself, turned on itself with terrifying rapidity. A dispute over a hunting territory could escalate into brutal physical punishment. Arguments that might have been settled in the light of reason became nights-long feuds, punctuated by screams and blows, leaving lasting scars on both body and mind. Some members began to vanish, not to be seen again. The elders whispered that the hollow demanded obedience, that the pact Silas had made required a constant toll. Younger cousins, attempting to flee the cabins under cover of darkness, were often found days later, disoriented, wandering along the ridges with no memory of how they arrived there. Others disappeared entirely, swallowed by the forest without a trace, leaving only broken branches and the occasional hint of a child's cry lingering in the wind. Violence became ritualized. Every generation brought forth individuals who were inexplicably stronger, faster, and more volatile than their peers. Simple disagreements could ignite explosive bouts of fury. A quarrel over food, a glance deemed disrespectful, or a minor challenge to authority could lead to injuries, sometimes fatal. Bloodshed was no longer rare. It became an accepted, even expected aspect of daily life. Parents sometimes turned on children, children on parents, siblings on siblings. Each act of violence only reinforced the hollow's sinister hold over them. The curse seemed to escalate with every violent act. Shadows lengthened, whispers grew louder, and the oppressive presence of ancestor spirits became nearly unbearable. The bloodline's madness intertwined with the supernatural, blurring reality and nightmare. There were nights when the family would awaken to find symbols drawn in ash across floors, their meaning known only to unseen eyes. Others reported doors opening or closing on their own, fires igniting spontaneously, or cold hands grasping at them from the darkness. Fear became not just emotional, but physical, pressing down on the chest, constricting the mind, and driving even the strongest to irrational acts. As generations passed, feuds became almost ceremonial. The elders encouraged loyalty to the family above all else, yet suspicion was ingrained so deeply that no one trusted anyone else entirely. Cousins accused each other of plotting against the family, siblings accused siblings, and parents accused children of failing the bloodline. Many of these accusations resulted in brutal punishment and occasionally murder. The hollow seemed to feed on these acts, each violent deed further entwining the family with the land and the curse. Attempts to escape the hollow almost always ended in tragedy. One infamous story tells of two brothers who, in a rare moment of rebellion, tried to leave the property with plans to start new lives in a nearby town. Days later, they were found deep in the forest, huddled together, pale and shaking, unable to speak of what had forced them back. Their clothing was tattered, their hair matted with mud, and their eyes wide with the realization that the hollow had claimed them in some ineffable way. Those who attempted defiance were often found dead, sickened, or driven to insanity, reinforcing the unspoken rule. No one leaves the hollow unscathed. Within the cabins, the nightly atmosphere was unbearable. Screams echoed across the hollow, each sound a warning and a reminder of the family's fragility. Those not caught in a violent outburst lived in constant fear of the next. Parents would awaken to find children missing from their beds, only to discover them hours later wandering in trance-like states, muttering secrets of the hollow no one else could understand. Arguments over inheritance, hunting territories, or even the placement of a bed could escalate into deadly confrontations. The curse thrived in this chaos, feeding on fear and violence alike. The psychological toll was immense. The hollow's influence extended beyond physical violence. Family members began experiencing hallucinations, glimpses of ancestors standing silently at the edge of rooms, shadows stretching across walls, and whispers that foretold tragic events. Those deemed weak or rebellious were haunted relentlessly, their every movement monitored by unseen eyes. Over time, it became impossible to distinguish reality from the influence of the hollow. Madness was not a threat. It was inevitable. By the end of this turbulent era, the Devil's Hollow kin had become a family defined by blood and brutality. Their reputation among outsiders had transformed into legend, a cautionary tale of isolation, obsession, and the consequences of an unholy pact. The hollow itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of violence within its boundaries, absorbing each act of cruelty, each scream, and each whisper. It was no longer merely a home. It was a crucible of fear, forging each generation in the flames of madness, and leaving behind nothing but shadows and bloodied memories. Hollow demanded obedience, and the Crothers, whether through fear, superstition, or the curse itself, complied. Murder, madness, and whispers became intertwined in the very fabric of their existence. Any who survived were scarred, both physically and mentally, carrying the weight of the family's violent history into their adulthood. And the pact, set into motion centuries earlier by Silas Crowther, continued to assert its power, ensuring that the hollow remained both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where life and death were inseparable, and where the bloodline's torment could never be escaped. By the early decades of the 20th century, the once thriving Crowther clan had dwindled to only a handful of surviving members. Generations of violence, madness, and supernatural torment had taken their toll, leaving the hollow sparsely populated and eerily quiet except for the occasional whisper or scream that cut through the fog like a knife. The youngest members of the family, barely into adolescence, now carried the full weight of the bloodline, burdened by both the family legacy and the curse that had haunted their ancestors for over a century. The youngest Crothers were gaunt, pale, and unervingly alert. They moved with a predatory awareness, their senses attuned to every shadow, every whisper of wind, every creak of the floorboards. Some were quick to anger, their tempers inherited from generations of feuding elders. Others retreated into silence, their eyes reflecting a depth of fear and understanding that seemed far beyond their years. These children knew instinctively that the hollow demanded loyalty, and that disobedience, even in thought, could bring disaster. Storms became more frequent and violent over time, as if the hollow itself had learned to manifest its rage physically. Lightning split trees, winds tore through cabins, and the forest groaned with the weight of the tempest. The family huddled within their homes, doors bolted, and fires kept burning. But even then, safety was an illusion. Branches crashed through roofs, roofs caved under heavy rain, and the shadows seemed to grow bolder with every flash of lightning. The youngest kin learned quickly that nature itself conspired with the curse, reinforcing the hollow's suffocating grip. Disappearances continued to plague the hollow. Children sometimes vanished for hours, only to return in a trance-like state, whispering words that no living adult could understand. Livestock disappeared as well, sometimes found days later, mutilated or entirely drained of life, as though some unseen hand had marked them for sacrifice. The youngest generation became witnesses and participants in these horrors, internalizing the belief that the Hollow was a living entity, a being that demanded obedience, blood, and fear in equal measure. Fire became a constant threat. Accidents, whether caused by carelessness, supernatural influence, or sheer misfortune, ravaged the family's structures. One cabin burned entirely, forcing the young kin to flee into the storm-lashed woods, only to emerge hours later, exhausted, soaked, and terrified. The Hollow seemed to test them continually, a relentless crucible designed to shape the survivors into vessels capable of carrying the curse forward. Every day brought new trials, new manifestations of the pact that Silas had forged generations earlier. Isolation intensified. With so few remaining, the young Crothers became increasingly interdependent, yet equally mistrustful. Arguments sparked quickly, often erupting into violence. Each act of aggression seemed to feed the Hollow, reinforcing its sinister power and embedding fear deeper into the minds of the children. The family's survival depended as much on obedience to the land and the whispers of ancestors, as it did on their ability to navigate the deadly emotional landscape created by centuries of madness. Despite their youth, the youngest kin demonstrated startling resilience. Some learned to anticipate the Hollow's moods, reading the movement of shadows, the behavior of animals, and the patterns of the wind. Others exhibited a strange, almost supernatural intuition, avoiding areas deemed dangerous or retreating before accidents could occur. Yet no skill could fully shield them from the curse. The Hollow was patient. It waited, always biding its time, observing, ensuring that the youngest generation understood the full weight of the legacy they carried. The family's dynamic had shifted. Where once there had been larger groups and extended networks, now only a few faces remained, each marked by the Hollow's influence. Fear, superstition, and the lessons of survival dominated daily life. The children learned quickly which paths were safe, which areas were taboo, and how to appease the unseen forces that haunted them. Sleep was scarce, for dreams often became nightmares, visions of ancestors demanding obedience, or reminders of past misdeeds. The youngest generation became both prisoners and inheritors, bound to the Hollow by blood and fear. As time passed, it became clear that this generation might be the last to truly bear the weight of the Crowther legacy. With each passing storm, each disappearance, and each act of violence, the family edged closer to final collapse. The land itself seemed to conspire toward inevitability, as if the Hollow had determined that the bloodline must either end or be completely reshaped by the curse. And in the shadows, the whispers continued, unrelenting, ensuring that the children would never forget the lessons of obedience, terror, and survival. The last generation of the Devil's Hollow kin stood at the precipice of fate, haunted daily by the sins of ancestors and the restless spirits of the Hollow. Their lives were measured in fear and survival, guided by whispers and shadows. The Hollow, storm-lashed and unforgiving, continued to shape them, ensuring that whatever legacy remained would be one of terror, secrecy, and the unending cycle of darkness that Silas Crowther had set into motion over a century before. Years had passed since the Hollow had last seen a thriving family. The storms, the fires, and the relentless curse had thinned the Crothers to almost nothing. Word of the Hollow's dangers continued to circulate in the nearby valleys, but curiosity or necessity eventually drew outsiders to its borders. They came in small groups, hunters seeking game, wanderers drawn by the eerie tales, and a few brave souls who believed the stories to be exaggerations. None were prepared for what they would find, The first sign of the Hollow's collapse was the cabins themselves. Buildings that had once stood sturdy against the winds and storms now lay in ruin. Roofs had caved under years of neglect, floors were warped and rotted, and walls bore the scars of centuries of violence. Some cabins had been burned entirely, the charred remains blackened and smoldering, as if some unseen hand had completed the task of erasing the family from the land. The smell of ash mixed with the familiar sulphurous tang that locals had long associated with the Hollow, a scent that made the hair on the back of the neck stand on end. Inside the remnants of the cabins, there was no sign of life. Beds lay overturned, belongings were scattered as if abandoned in haste, and personal items, toys, tools, and keepsakes were left behind, untouched yet eerily arranged. In the corners, shadows seemed to linger longer than light allowed, and faint marks in the soil suggested movements that defied logic. Nothing indicated that the occupants had simply left. The air was thick with the sense that something or someone had been violently removed. The outsiders searched the surrounding woods, calling out names and scanning the tree line for any hint of the missing family. Yet the forest remained silent, unyielding, and suffocatingly still. Animals avoided the area entirely. Birds had fled, and even wolves kept their distance. Occasionally, a soft cry or rustle of leaves would catch the searchers' attention, only to vanish when approached. It was as though the Hollow itself absorbed life and repelled investigation. The more time they spent, the more unnerving the landscape became. Footprints appeared and disappeared without explanation. Tracks led to the burned cabins and vanished into the dense undergrowth. Trees bore scratches and etchings that seemed to form patterns, symbols that no outsider could understand, yet which radiated an ominous authority. These marks suggested that the Crothers' rituals, fears, and curses had not ended with their disappearance. Rather, the Hollow itself had inherited their vigilance and secrecy. Locals arrived shortly after, drawn by reports of outsiders daring to enter the Forbidden Land. They confirmed what the searchers feared. The Hollow had been emptied, but not naturally. Whispers carried across the ridges, hinting at unseen figures watching, and some swore they could see fleeting glimpses of pale faces peering from behind trees. The stories reinforced what everyone already knew. The Crowther family may have vanished, but their influence and the curse of the Hollow remained alive, woven into the soil, the shadows, and the very air. Even decades later, the Hollow remained uninhabitable. Travelers who attempted to linger reported unexplained fires, sudden disappearances, and inexplicable cold spots that seemed to reach into the soul. It was as if the land itself demanded that no one replace the Crothers, that their legacy of fear, secrecy, and violence could never truly be undone. Devil's Hollow was no longer merely a family home. It had become a monument to absence, a place where the living and the dead blurred, and where the vanished continued to haunt the minds of anyone daring enough to tread its soil. The vanishing of the Devil's Hollow kin was complete in body, but not in presence. Charred wood, twisted metal, and scorched earth marked their disappearance, while the Hollow's whispers, shadows, and eerie stillness ensured that their story would linger. Those who had ventured too close left changed, carrying with them the undeniable knowledge that some places and some bloodlines are never truly gone. They simply wait, hidden in the fog and the forest, for the next curious soul to stumble upon them. Even after the Hollow was emptied, the stories never died. Generations of locals grew up hearing whispered warnings about the Devil's Hollow kin, tales meant to keep children away and adults cautious. The land remained shrouded in mist, its trees dense and foreboding, as if shielding the Hollow from the outside world. Yet the Hollow was far from silent. Those brave enough to approach its borders spoke of fleeting shadows, pale faces glimpsed among the trees, and the faintest hints of voices carried by the wind, Echoes of a bloodline that refused to vanish. Folklore evolved alongside reality. Hunters, hikers, and travelers who dared near the hollow reported the same patterns over decades. Lights appearing and disappearing in impossible places, footsteps following them along unmarked paths, and the unnerving sensation of being watched from every shadow. Some swore they saw children with piercing eyes peering from the fog, figures that vanished before confrontation. Others felt hands brush against them when no one was there, or heard whispers in a language that chilled the soul. The hollow had become a living legend, a haunted monument to generations of violence, fear, and unbroken bloodlines. Local elders passed on the warnings with solemn gravity. "Stay away," they said. "The hollow remembers." The kin are still there, waiting, and in the quietest hours, the hollow seemed to respond. Even storms carried whispers, and the wind through the ridges brought faint echoes of screams. The land itself had absorbed the curse, the fears, and the rituals of the Crowther family, ensuring that Devil's Hollow remained a place where the living and the dead overlapped, where the past never truly rested. To this day, Devil's Hollow endures in memory and myth. Travelers who ignore the warnings often return with stories of unexplainable events, or they do not return at all. Ghostly apparitions, unnatural shadows, and strange lights are a reminder that the hollow is more than just a geographic location. It is a vessel of a curse that spans generations. The Devil's Hollow kin may be gone in body, but their legacy of terror, their bloodline's curse, and the hollow's haunting presence live on. Some say that, on quiet nights, if one listens carefully, the hollow whispers names, stories, and warnings to anyone who dares to tread its misty paths. The curse is unbroken. The shadows remain. And the Devil's Hollow kin, though vanished from sight, continue to haunt the land they once ruled, a terrifying reminder that some legacies are never truly laid to rest.